afternoon. How's everybody doing? God bless. God bless. Pastor Sam and the Gospel Gunslingers coming at you from sunny Mexico. And it is sunny, but a cold front has come in, and it's actually frigid. I have a lot to say about the Texas Raiders disaster, and of course, the B-17 is very close to the show. It's my profile pic on a lot of platforms, and my grandfather flew the B-17 heroically for 35 combat missions. So I want to do a breakdown of the Airshow disaster and something of a tribute for the airmen lost and their families. Hey, couple notes. I got a copy of this book. In English, it's called Lucifer Dethroned. And this is Bill Schnoebelen. And that's how you spell Schnoebelen, Schnoebelen. So I would recommend every believer have a copy of this book. And it's a manual of spiritual warfare. He's an Iowan, by the way. And this book used to be carried by Chick Publications while the old man was still alive, when Jack Chick was alive, because Bill Schnoebelen and Sharon Schnoebelen were friends of Jack Chick, and he believed them and trusted their testimony. This is a first-hand account of someone who was deep, deep in the occult. And I understand that for Christian believers, there is often a long period of years when they're in Christ and they still haven't crossed over to the world of the miraculous, the supernatural, angelic visitations, and especially victory over the demonic, and understanding of how much dark power of sorcery is out there and how much it's working against us every day. And so this is where I'd just like to recommend Bill Schnoebelen's testimony. So there are two books in this series. One is Blood on the Doorposts. I believe that's actually the first. And this is Lucifer Dethroned, which I think is the second one. And I wish Chick would carry these, continue to carry these. I found it at a bookstore. It's probably been sitting there for years. But I've got this copy, and listen, this guy was deep, deep in the occult. And if you don't know, Dubuque, Iowa used to be the seat of the Catholic Archdiocese for all west of the Mississippi, all of the northwestern lands from the Mississippi River and beyond, all the way up into what's now Canada, Montana, all of those lands and all the Indian tribes in those lands that had what they call evangelization efforts, Catholic colonization efforts. All of that was headquartered and quarterbacked and planned out of Dubuque, Iowa. And so it was later on that the archdioceses were carved up and the smaller seats were made. But Dubuque, Iowa, even today, there's a tremendous occult power over that little city. It's a small city. Anyway, that's not really the subject of my show today, but I wanted to tell you all that I came across that book, and it's something that you should own while you can get it. Hopefully soon I will get a copy of a book called The Cross and the Crown by Ellie Hine and her husband. I won't get his first name right if I say it. He published this book under a pseudonym, and it was published anonymously in the first printing. The book that I got a hold of as a young missionary, The Cross and the Crown, was that version where he referred to himself as Brother Joshua, referring, of course, to Joshua in the Bible, who took the promised land and was the Lord's ambassador in time of war. And so when I get that book, I believe it's public domain. I believe that he published it and released the rights. And so, and it's very hard to find. I found one on the 5th floor library of Oral Roberts University, but it's in the Holy Spirit Research Center. You have to go into that center and they'll get the book for you and you can sit there and read it. But when I've actually got a copy and it's coming to me in Mexico, and once I get that, I'm going to read it to you on YouTube, and it will change your life. It's a shocking, shocking text. And if you can get a hold of a copy, please do it. Eventually, Christ for the Nations published that. All right, let's get some air conditioning while we're talking here. Praise the Lord. I know some people are going to come because they see the tragedy. Thank you, Ron. Thanks for coming along. We're glad to have you. I hope you can hear me okay with the air blowing. It shouldn't be too bad. If it is, please let me know in the comments, and I'll suffer. I'll turn it off and suffer in the heat. The Texas Raiders Airshow. This was an irreplaceable aircraft, and human lives are always irreplaceable. And the Bell P-63 Super Cobra, King Cobra, is also irreplaceable. There were only 5 specimens in the world that were airworthy, that were flying, of that King Cobra aircraft. And only 2, like this one, that had the Allison aircraft engine in it. And there were only 9 airworthy B-17s in the world. And so one of them now is gone. And they're 80 years old. They got tales to tell. This ship, Texas Raiders, I believe was one of the last ones off the line. Never saw combat, which meant that it was not shot up, because that was just something that happened every day. Was they got shot up and got flak holes in them. Flak holes, cannon shell holes, and machine gun holes, because they banged it out with the Luftwaffe in the skies over Germany and occupied Europe every day. So I'd like to make a few comments on how I see this playing out, and I'd like to say that I'm going to have a little bit of a different take on it. You need to know that these men, these airmen, they laid their lives down to keep history alive for you and for me. I was a little kid, and Grandpa used to tell about flying the B-17. And he told about one time that he had to take a borrowed bird out, and as soon as the ships got to England, they made battle modifications to bring them up to the latest specification. And this was an unmodified ship that he and his crew had to climb into and take it right into battle. And so the windshield armor had not yet been installed. And he tells all about this in his book written by Roy R. Fisher Jr. and Susan Fisher Anderson, called The Lucky Bastards Club, Letters to My Bride from the Left Seat. Also an excellent book that everyone should own. It's my grandpa's personal story of love and war. So this tale is published in there, but I remember him telling it as I was a little kid, how he didn't have his armored windshield, and it was just 2 thin layers of plexiglass that he was looking through as he was flying. And as they came through the flak cloud on their final approach on the bomb run, where the flak was always the heaviest and where their formation was unable to maneuver. I'm still in Mexico. I live in Mexico. I don't come back anymore. Thank you for asking. I'm a refugee, and my supply lines are in severe danger, by the way. Any of you out there that can go to gospelgunslingers.com, click the donate button, one of 2 or 3 options, or send me a letter, send me a message, and send me $1. It is greatly appreciated. And I got a lot of exposure from Hal Turner and being on the Hal Turner show, but there came a point where I could not abide his anti-Semitism, and I had to make a clear break and not fellowship further with him. And as much as Hal talks about being right with God, and now war is on the horizon and get right with God, he's not right with God. And there's a serious rift between him and God over him hating the Lord's people and blaming them for all the ills in the world. So thank you for asking about that. I've actually lost a lot of friends and supporters since not coming on that show, but it's something that I had to do. Listen, he flatly states that there should be another extermination of that people group. That's his position. It's where he is. He does it all the time, and I don't call in there anymore. So thank you for asking, Anti-Communist. If you want to know more, feel free to send me a message on gospelgunslingers.com. But I can't fellowship with someone that has that virulent, murderous hatred towards the Lord's people. I can't do it. And for the rest of my audience, this is one of the things that's hurt me. Is I got lots of little bumps. There were a lot of people that followed me because of my call-ins on bigger shows like that. Fortunately, now I have my own worldwide radio show on WRMI Radio 9955 and on WBCQ Radio. So it's heard through all the United States, most all of Latin America, all the Caribbean, Central America, South America. It's at 7 Eastern on WBCQ and 6 Eastern on WRMI Monday nights. But listen, if you go to gospelgunslingers.com, you can go down to the archive. And I spoke a lot about the election results and things last night that I cannot get into here on YouTube. You know, this is a throttled platform. It's a restricted platform. And this is something that I wanted to talk about, opening up the throttles. If anybody saw the opening frame of this video, it is the cockpit of the B-17. And the pilot has his hand on the 4 throttle levers. There's 2 underneath and there's 2 on top. And he's got his hand on those, but up above is a dial that turns like this. And that dial is the turbo boost controller. And Grandpa told me all about this when I was a kid. I didn't understand it at the time, but I just listened as much as I could. And then as I got older and learned more about these things, I learned about it. The B-17 was designed for high altitude daylight precision bombing. And they could go 30 to 35,000 feet. All the men, because the cabin was unpressurized, wore oxygen masks and electric heated suits that would plug into the wall. And this is why Texas Raiders, the B-17 that crashed and burned just over the weekend in their Veterans Day Airshow, that's why they were out there, is so that people could walk out on the tarmac and peek inside. You can even pay a few $100s that they use for a fundraiser, and of course you've got to pay for the fuel. You could take a ride in these, and my grandpa did. He took a ride in the B-17 aluminum overcast, and I believe it's aluminum overcast that is in my cover pictures on gospelgunslingers.com. So you can look in the cockpit and see the boost wheel. You can walk underneath of the engines, and underneath of every engine is a turbocharger. It's got to be a foot in diameter. They're the biggest turbochargers I've ever seen for those huge aviation engines. And then each one of the engines also had a centrifugal supercharger on the shaft, on the crankshaft of the motor. I've got a cutaway from the museum in Galveston, Texas, of the Wright Cyclone engine, cutaway where you can see that centrifugal supercharger. So Grandpa talked about them being turbo supercharged engines. And as I got a little older, you know, and was a teenager, like, which is it? Well, it is both. They had turbochargers on all 4 engines, and you can see them from the bottom of the plane. And then each of those went into the centrifugal supercharger on the shaft of the individual engine. But all of them were controlled by that boost knob that Grandpa had, and it's on the opening frame of this video. So Grandpa had access to that. And by the way, on a 4-engine bomber, when you go into combat, you know, multi-engine aircraft, one of the big dangers is losing an engine, because it changes the flight dynamics, especially on takeoff. We're going to talk a little bit about the Doolittle raid. I was just studying the Doolittle raid, and if you don't know, Jimmy Doolittle is the one who pioneered 100 octane aviation gasoline, which when you are at any airport, if you're out there with the small planes, the gassers, the piston planes, run on avgas. It's 100 octane aviation gas. You know, pump gas like 87 octane, 89, you buy premium 91, or if you really shop the high rent district and have a hot stock car, 93 octane. So 100 octane is like, you got to buy racing fuel at the drag strip to get 100 octane. It was Jimmy Doolittle, who had left the Air Force during the 1930s and worked for Shell Oil. And so as someone he was racing, he was working, doing aviation racing, and he was working for Shell Oil, and he moved Shell Oil to develop 100 octane aviation gas. By the way, today you can still find, if you're building your own hot rod and it's forced air induction, if it's supercharged and or turbocharged, you can still find recipes out there for this head, this crankshaft, this piston to run on aviation gasoline. Here's the caveat. It's leaded. And so it's got to be like a 1960s muscle car if you run it on the street, because if you run that aviation gasoline, it's leaded gasoline, which is why, you can't run it in a modern car. It'll ruin your catalytic converters. But Jimmy Doolittle did all that when he was in racing, because he saw the trend towards turbo supercharged engines. He saw that they were going to run a lot of boost, and so they needed high octane. And then really long before the U.S. entered the war was beginning, Jimmy Doolittle actually went to Europe and 2 weeks ahead informed General Hap Arnold that war was imminent. And 2 weeks later, it broke out. Germany began their invasions. So this is how 100 octane avgas came to be, because Jimmy Doolittle saw this movement towards more and more and more forced air induction, which is not only an equation of horsepower, it's about operating in the thin air of altitude. And so this is what allowed the B-17 to be faster than any plane had ever been. It could run, the prototypes before they up-armored and up-armed them could run 350 knots with a full bomb load. That had never been done. And then the service ceiling was higher than any other bomber had been before. So these turbo supercharged engines were the key to doing that, to being faster and flying higher. Of course, when the jets started coming out, that was quite another thing that I've talked about in other videos. So right there is the boost wheel. And as the altitude increased, as the need for maximum power was not there, he'd turn it down. And all those controls, if you look to the forward and to the right, the four smaller knobs that you see on the control are mixture levers. So he had to monitor the exhaust temperature of each one of those engines and rich or lean them as he was running. And sometimes they would either get a runaway prop or a runaway turbocharger, where in the thin air it would lose its grip and it would run away. And so Grandpa would have to back that engine off individually, and then once it got grip, either on the propeller and or the turbocharger, he would bring it back up into working with the other three engines. And this is something that he had to do all day long. He'd only fly for 15 minutes, and then his co-pilot would fly for 15 minutes, and he'd actually nap in between. It was only because he saw the women pilots that he thought, as small as he was, that he could handle flying that great big ship. The controls were manual. The hydraulics were just for the landing gear and stuff. He had to fight the controls, manual controls on that ship. But he saw the WASP pilots, the women's auxiliary service pilots that delivered the B-17s, and when he saw those little ladies step out of the cockpit of that giant warbird, that's when Grandpa said, "I think I can fly this bird." He weighed about 115 pounds at the time and was 5'6". Anyway, he had to watch all those dials and keep all four of those engines running, and that was when they all ran. Sometimes they'd blow. He'd lose one. And of course, you get into battle, the name of the game is blowing out the engines. So the Luftwaffe would come in with cannon fire. they would strafe the formation and do as much damage as they could. So Grandpa would try to keep it really tight, where they could concentrate all their guns and the guns of their neighboring ships on those aircraft when they came in. Anyhow, if Grandpa lost an engine, if he lost 2 engines, he was only allowed to turn that dial up to 7. And you see it goes up to 10. Well, 8, 9, and 10 were military emergency settings. So if he was in a horrible fight where lives were on the line, wounded men, he was going down, had engines shot out, or had to get away, had to get out of trouble fast, in a military emergency, he could push the limit. He could push the limit, and it's right on that boost controller, and he could turn the radio up to the maximum. Of course, an engine can just detonate if you do that. It can just fly apart. But these are the risks that we take. And all of them knew that. All of these men knew that. And all of the men who were flying Texas Raiders knew that. I just want to share a few things from the Air Force hymn. I'm not going to play it. Maybe I'll play it on my radio show Monday, because you'll just have to see me cry while it's playing. So I'll save that for the radio audience. You know, the final stanza line in the Wild Blue Yonder, the Air Force hymn, which you can just search that on YouTube, Wild Blue Yonder or Air Force hymn, and it'll come right up. One of the final stanza lines is, "If you'll live to be a gray-haired wonder, keep your nose out of the blue." And the point is, you have to know that your life's on the line every day to be in military aviation. You have to know that you're pushing the limits, that you're flirting with death. An earlier line says, "How they lived, God only knew." God only knew. Grandpa came home to empty bunks. Every day, every mission, he saw the ships go down. Every mission, the Luftwaffe was there, waiting for him. And the ground cannons were horrible. You know, people talk about AK or flak. It's huge cannons. It's an artillery gun. It's a gun so big that they had to build the biggest tank the world had ever seen to mount it in the turret of that tank. And even then, it was the terror of Allied tankers, because that gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman tank out to like 5,000 yards. And Grandpa faced them every day. It was the same gun in an anti-aircraft mount. And a lot of them were radar controlled. They had a very sophisticated mechanism. One of them was called tracking flak, and very nearly brought Grandpa's ship down on the very first flight that his first mission, where he took his own crew. He flew 2 missions as co-pilot. Then his third mission, he took the pilot's seat with his own crew that he trained with into battle. And the tail gunner, everybody's on the intercom, you know, they had their little button on, it's on the wall, on the firewall. They turn that knob, and they can broadcast on the intercom between the 9 men that are on there, so everybody hears it. And so the tail gunner was sitting there, manning his post, with his hands on his gun controls, watching their 6 o'clock. And as he's out there watching out the back of the aircraft through his plexiglass and his armor, poof, he sees a little puff, a black smoke, straight behind him, a ways back. They said that if you could hear it, it was getting close, because otherwise, with all the noise of the engines, it'd just make a puff. If you could hear it, it was getting close. And then they said, when it's danger close, the aircraft shakes. They also said The aircraft would shake when the fighters came in and all the guns are going off simultaneously. Huge 50 caliber guns, you know, the same gun that you see mounted on Humvees today, mounted on Coast Guard ships. They had 13 of them sticking out, many of them, you know, in twin conformations. In the tail guns, the turret, the ball turret, and the top turret, and the chin turret were all twins, twin 50s. And so when the Luftwaffe was buzzing around, all of those guns would be firing. This one is let it burst, and that one, and they'd all be fighting their sector, and the whole ship would shake with all those heavy machine guns going on. It's a heavy machine gun. The Luftwaffe actually got bigger. They went to cannons. You know, they went up to 37 millimeter with explosive shells. Anti-communists, there's a point where we have to disfellowship people. And the Bible also says there is a sin unto death. And I do not say that you should pray for that. This is the Valley of Achor and the Door of Hope. It's where we denounce people publicly. And the gospel gunslingers are all about finding the guilty, condemning them, and punishing them for many crimes, which in the United States, for example, treason is on record punishable by death, by the death penalty, and we're for that. And let me tell you, when the lights go out, when civility breaks down, there's going to be not only a lot of ass whoopings, there's going to be a lot of death penalty. Just bang, bang, bang. It's going to happen all the time. And it should. It should be far more prevalent than it is. We don't allow these people in our midst. All right, so the tail gunner is looking out his plexiglass. All the engines are droning. Hour after hour. And here he sees a puff. And he continues watching. And then, close to him, was a puff. Poof. This was the tracking flak. And they could only get off 3 shots before the aircraft was out of their range. But every shot, they had an optic on the cannon. They had an optic that would track one aircraft out of the whole formation. And they talk about aluminum overcast because the pilots joked. It was a joke. The forecast today is for aluminum overcast. The whole sky is going to be heavy bombers that have come to level the place. And they did level many, many places. When the tail gunner, they'd never flown together. This was the tail gunner's first time into battle. They just sweated it out while Grandpa flew co-pilot 2 times with an experienced crew. So this is his first time in battle. I think it was Stan that was the co-pilot on Grandpa's ship, the Mission Bell. He saw that second flak puff. And he got on the intercom, reached over to the wall, clicked the intercom, and he said, "We got tracking flak, pull high and right." And Grandpa heard that in the pilot's seat, and he had the controls. And he was in a combat box formation, which means that just off of his wingtip is the wingtip of the next ship. And they did that for defense against fighters, so that the fighter couldn't go between them. And the fighters would actually go around looking for a loose formation where they could shoot through with their cannons, and they'd fly between the planes. So Grandpa made a point to keep it tight and to make sure all of his neighbors kept it tight. So their wingtips are just feet away from one another on these great big ships. But he could go up. And his tail gunner said, "We got tracking flak, pull high and right." And he did that. Pulled his ship out of formation, which was a big no-no because that opened him up to fighters. But he had to do it or they were going to die. And that third burst went off. Pow! And it was so close that both ships that were still in formation were damaged. It would have hit them directly in the bomb bay, which is the worst place. All those bombs go off, you know. It's a huge explosive artillery shell, that tracking flak. So when you go to these air shows, or even if you watch, the guys out on the tarmac, they'll hold up a little piece, say, "This is flak," and it is. That's a fragment from the artillery shell. If it goes off on the outside, but the core of it is it's a huge cannon shell. It's a huge artillery projectile. It's full of explosives. So the time that Grandpa had to run that loner into battle, they didn't like that. They liked their own ship with their own crew chief that talked to the ground crew chief, and they worked everything out where it was all ready to go in the morning. They just turned the propellers through. Grandpa would walk around and do his check, kick the tires, and light the fires. Crank it up and go. He'd just do his checks. But this time they took a loner out, and it didn't have the modified armored windshield. They figured out they needed windshield armor because the Luftwaffe would make a head-on attack. They'd come straight on, nose to nose. And of course, the fighters were faster. And they'd be way out there, and then here they'd come nose to nose, and then just in that moment of closing, because their closing speed's like, 700, 800 knots? They'd fire the cannons. And of course, Grandpa's chin gunner would be shooting at them with those twin 50s. And that's why they had an armored windshield. And it helped against flak too. So here's Grandpa's 22 years old, skinny as a rail, 5'6", soaking wet. He's flying through the flak cloud. They got all the cannons right there around the factories that Grandpa's trying to destroy. So here's his crew. His bombardiers got the Norden bomb sight. Grandpa actually would take his hands off the controls because the Norden bomb sight would fly the ship. And then all the other ships in the flight stay level and even with his ship. And then all the bombs will pretty much go on the point of that lead ship that's got the Norden bomb sight. So Grandpa would take his hands off the controls for about 2 minutes. And sometimes the cloud was just thick black from those cannon puffs going off as flight after flight of bombers would try to hit the same industrial complex. Sometimes over 1,000 ships, over 1,000 bombers, heavy bombers. So Grandpa's got his hands off the controls, sweating it out for 2 minutes. Sometimes guys would go crazy. I got a book called Bailout, and one of the crewmen who bailed out 3 times had ships, destroyed, where the pilot ordered bailout, or they were shot to bits and coming apart. But they were at altitude, and the guys would try to jump out however they could and parachute into enemy territory. He had a guy go crazy on him. And he grabbed the guy and threw him on the deck and sat on top of him while they were going through the flak cloud. Because it's pitch black, you could smell the cordite, and it just goes ping, ping, ping as those shards of hot metal are hitting the ship. And it's just thin aluminum. It's not much more than a pop can. Go to an air show and see these old ships if you can. Climb into it. Go to a museum. There's a great one in Galveston, Texas. You know what? It's actually now, they moved it to the airport east of Houston. You can just go right in, and there is the B-17, and you can walk all around it and touch it. So it was a very long 2 minutes going through that flak cloud on the final approach. And they couldn't maneuver. They just had to, and some of those flak shells would hit. And that's when the planes would just explode. The wing would come off. They'd catch a hit, and the wing root was a horrible place because the wing it'd just blow the whole wing off and the fuel tanks and everything. Very few seconds to bail out. Or the bomb bay. It's a terrible place to get hit because that's just instant. Boom, it's over. The whole thing just goes up. And Grandpa saw that many times. So a flak projectile came up and went puff out in front, and the flak, the shrapnel hit that windshield, the unarmored windshield, and it went through the first piece of plexiglass and stuck in the second piece. It was just a sandwich of two little thin pieces of plexiglass. And it stuck right there, and it was right in Grandpa's face. So it was just a moment after that the bombardier said, "Bombs away," which that was Grandpa's cue to grab the yoke and get the heck out of there. That meant that he could maneuver to try to keep from getting hit. And I remember as a kid, Grandpa lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the time. I remember as a kid, Grandpa told that he looked at that piece of shrapnel, that piece of flak, all the way home. And I thought to as a little kid, you know, with my big eyes, I thought, all the way to Milwaukee? You know, it takes a while to understand the concept. How they lived, God only knew. It's in the hymn. If you'll live to be a gray-haired wonder, keep your nose out of the blue. As a kid, it took me a while to get to understand that there was World War, there was Festung Europa, the fortress Europe. It was all occupied by our enemies, by tyrants, and that all of England was paved into bases. He flew 35 combat missions. 35. From 1944 to 1945. And when he got there, of course, guess what? He's crawling into one of the empty bunks. That was a guy that everybody knew that's dead. Or his ship went down. Maybe they saw parachutes. When a ship went down, everybody, you know, all the gunners especially, that are manning their sector. So you got a waist gunner that's looking left and right. You've got a ball turret gunner that's watching underneath. And when one of their fellow ships goes down, he knows which ship it is. They got tail numbers on them, and they know those guys. They know their comrades over in that ship. And so they would count the chutes. And of course, you really wanted to get to 9. They flew with 9 crew members on each ship. And they'd say, okay, this ship went down. I counted 7 chutes. All right. That was way better than it could have been. But when the whole thing's blown to bits already, you know, that's a success. That only 2 guys didn't get out. That 7 of them at least took the chance to jump into occupied territory. There's so much to it. Grandpa had walkout boots. I have his walkout boots today. They're brand new. I wear them sometimes for special occasions. They fit me. And he had those in his rucksack because they wore insulated fleece flight boots. And in the event that they were shot down, then he would put on those walkout boots and attempt to escape the continent on foot or with the resistance, link up with the resistance, go from country to country. And a lot of people successfully did that. So they were taking a chance, and they might even be wounded. You know, they could be bleeding or have holes in them. When their ship goes down, the bailout's either ordered or the ship breaks apart. And then those guys try to get out. Grandpa never ditched at sea because he knew statistically that out of his 9 guys, 2 guys would die if he put it down on the water. Just the statistics of it. So he tried his very best to never ditch at sea. And one time, he only had 2 engines going. And he never told me whether he used the boost dial to go to the maximum. But once they threw out all the guns, threw out all those Ma Deuces and all their ammunition into the sea, everything that wasn't bolted down, they threw it out. And he got enough altitude to get up over the cliffs of Dover, but not without getting their ball turret wet. I'll bet that Grandpa cranked the boost dial to the maximum and took a risk to not lose 2 men, to not lose two of his guys. You know, they were like his little brothers, and he was the old man, right, at 22. I want you to understand that in Dallas, this was a great tragedy. But I'm going to bring forth a few points that you're not going to hear in the media, because everybody's going to cry about this. And I want you to know that that tragedy Grandpa lived with every day. Okay? 5,000 times. Over 5,000 B-17s were lost. And that's aside from fighter aircraft, from B-24s, from the British. 5,000 of those ships were lost. And Grandpa saw it every day. Every one of those 35 missions. He saw ships go down in flames, the wings get blown off, them just explode and the guys never have a chance, them struggle to maintain formation and fall behind, and then the Luftwaffe would just come in like vultures. You know, they'd come in like a pack of wolves on a wounded animal and just hammer that ship. If you're a fan of heavy bombardment and you haven't seen Angelina Jolie's movie that she directed of Louis, what's his name? It's an Italian name, Zamperini. It's called Unbreakable, and it takes place on the B-24 Liberator anti-communist, and it takes place on the it takes place in the Pacific. But they retell the true story of Louis Zamperini, not only as a POW, Japanese held, but they tell the tale of a terrible firefight where they went in and bombed a Japanese island, and Zamperini's ship that he was a gunner on, their bomb bay doors wouldn't close. Well, that meant a reduction in airspeed, and it meant that their fuel supply was in danger because they lost efficiency. It was shot out. They couldn't get it shut. So all the Zeros that scrambled, the Japanese Zero fighters that scrambled up off of this little base in the Pacific, they went after that ship, that B-24, because they were out of their combat box formation. They could come in on it at any angle. All right, I'm going to tell you a little secret. Tell you a little secret of what my dog tag is. There it is. The High Ninja made this for me. You probably can't read it. But this is a name that the Germans had for the B-17. Fliegendes Stachelschwein. And what it means is the flying porcupine. And this is the philosophy of the gospel gunslingers. Look, we're here. The wicked can come at us from any angle, but they're going to get some. Whatever angle they come in, at the B-17, there was a gunner watching for them. And they had to attack facing those guns. And that's why they called it the flying porcupine. The head-on attack, that chin gunner was right there. He was right there. And he was firing at them. They came in at the belly. There was the ball turret watching for them. Any angle. They had waist gunners. They had cheek gunners. They had a top turret. We were ahead of the Germans in turret technology. There were a lot of places where we were playing catch-up. But our turret technology, especially the Bendix Corporation, was ahead of them. And so we had these phenomenal hydraulic electric turrets. There's one at the museum in Houston. If you go out to that airport and rock into that museum, you can see the Bendix turret cut away. The top turret. That thing weighed like 1,500 pounds. With all the armor and the guns and the ammunition. It had like a bicycle seat. And then here's the levers where the gunner controls the hydraulics to whiz that thing around. And it had a mechanism where he could just keep on shooting, and when he crossed the tail of the aircraft, it had cut out and the guns would not fire. Just for a moment, to not shoot his own tail off. He could focus on that fighter, and there was that safety, and he could just zing right around. Didn't matter which angle they came in. There was a defense. And of course, Wait, what Grandpa really wanted is his whole 36 ship formation to be tight together. And then when that fighter comes in, he's got 36 top turrets, and they're all shooting at him. And then he was really at a disadvantage. That's why they would just fly around and figure out who woke up drunk, who's not paying attention, who's not keeping their box tight, who's having a mechanical problem, and then that's who they'd attack. It's the predator mindset. Criminals are the same way, and the soldiers are the same way. We're looking for a vulnerability. See a bandage, take advantage. Well, this happened to Zamperini as he's running his gunner's position on the B-24. Really happened. But go see it. Unbreakable. When this movie came out, I went and watched it in the theater, and then I probably paid 20 times. I'd go pay my money in the theater, walk in, watch the first 10 minutes of the movie because of this scene. And it's the aerial gunnery scene where his lone ship with the bomb bay doors open hammers it out with probably a dozen Zeros. And I think that they brought down like 9 of them. That's not why these ships were designed, to hold their own against a superior enemy when they're all by themselves. They were supposed to support one another. But this was the worst case scenario where they got separated, they couldn't keep up with the formation, and the wolf pack came in. Well, they gave them hell. Zamperini's ship. Finally, they shot down so many of those Zeros. I think they downed 9 Zeros. And the remaining 2 or 3 bugged out and went back to base. And Zamperini's ship then had to land. Shot to hell. It was bad. It was really shot up. And part of what was shot out was their brakes. And so they have to make a landing on an island airfield that was so small that the Seabees, after the Marines went in and took that island, the Seabees came in and they had to build a jetty out from the island to extend the runway. So they just, bulldozed rocks and boulders into the sea for hundreds of feet and made this jetty so that they could extend the runway just to get those big old bombers in the air with their full fuel load and bomb load, and so they could land if maybe something wasn't going right. So here's Zamperini's ship comes back in, and the brakes are shot out, the bomb bay doors are open, they can't get their landing gear down. They got a lot of problems. But still, it's better than ditching at sea. So they brought it in, and I mean, sparks flying. It was bad. And they show it all. Angelina Jolie directed that movie, and it's really phenomenal. It's the best aerial gunnery scene that I've ever seen, and really shows the story of what it was really like in those heavy bombers when they got in a bad situation. So Zamperini lived to tell about it. They had a saying, and pilots still do. They say any landing that you could walk away from is a good one, because you could get burned alive. This commentator on here is talking about the B-24. It was notorious for the fuel tanks leaking and catching fire. The fuel tank itself came right through the fuselage. So as you're walking through a B-24, you have to duck under the fuel tank. It's right there. So when machine gun and cannon fire comes in and punctures that fuel tank, incendiary machine gun bullets and explosive cannon shells, they light it on fire, and they were very prone to fire. Even though the Liberator fought very valiantly and did well, it's just one of the things that the airmen were concerned about, was it catching fire. Well, a lot of guys got burned to death, burned alive. And of course they get hit, the shrapnel and machine gun bullets wounds people, kills them. They're really anti-materiel rounds. We're talking heavy machine guns and auto cannons. It's not like a rifle, which is bad enough what it does to a human body. So a lot of guys just got shot dead, flying on the air crew. Now everybody that went down with Texas Raiders knew this. They knew this. And they lived their life. Now, they loved it, and they were having fun, okay? Doing what they did. But they also laid their life down to bring to you and to your generation. And me, a dumb kid that thought Grandpa was going to fly home to Milwaukee in the war. No. Went to Bassingbourn or something. Went to his base in England, or any base in England where he could put it down. Just tried to get over the cliffs of Dover. If you put it down in a cornfield, that's good enough. Try not to ditch at sea. That freezing cold water of the North Sea. These men live their lives. Texas Raiders, the entire, this foundation and all the charitable foundations that run these aircraft, they're trying to teach you and me one thing. They're trying to make gospel gunslingers out of a lot of dumb kids. They're trying to make flying porcupines out of soft people that know only peace and know only corrupt governments, corrupt police, and pedophile networks in power. We've forgotten how to defend ourselves, and we've forgotten how to live life like Grandpa did in 44 and 45, where these tragedies are not something that happens once every few decades. It was every day. Every day, every day. There were bunks empty. Ships went down in flames. Ships didn't come back. All the ground crews, all the guys with the wrenches, they tried to get a little sleep during the day because they worked all night. Sometimes they'd play a little baseball out on the tarmac to pass the time during those nervous hours when they're waiting for their ship to come back. And you know what they all did? They count the ships. They're waiting for the first one, which is why they played baseball and played catch, to pass the time as they were nervous. You know, these guys are scared that their buddies are going to get killed, shooting it out with the Luftwaffe. So when the first ship came in, finally the suspense is over, and yet is just beginning at the same time. The first ship comes in, they stop what they're doing. That's one. And they count the ships as they came in. And some of them would pop flares. There was one flare for mechanical damage, and there was one flare for wounded on board. Wounded on board was highest priority. If they had people bleeding, then they'd pop a red flare as they came up on the field. And that meant they were coming in immediately to land to try to save that guy's life. Maybe more than one guy would be wounded or dead. So those ships would land first. Next priority is ships with battle damage. They got engines shot out, control surfaces shot off or blown off, or maybe had mechanical failures in the air. So those ships had priority to land. But as they're coming in, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the air crews are watching them. And of course, they're looking for feathered propellers. If the propeller had been stopped and turned directly into the wind, into the airstream, that's a feathered propeller. They turn it like a feather. That's a whole other set of controls that Grandpa had, was to change the propeller pitch. So the ground crews are looking. They count that first ship. All right, is it damaged? Is it shot up? Is it popping red flares? Has it got all four propellers spinning? Is it all there? Because a lot of times the B-17 was a horse. It was a fort. It could take a lot of punishment. But they'd worry if they were shot up bad. So they're looking for that. And then they're counting the ships. Say their airfield's got 12 ships, 24 ships, 36. They're counting them. And boy, they worried. Sometimes, when it was bad, less than half would come back. Sometimes they'd all come back out of that squadron, out of that outfit. A lot of times, they'd be missing some. And then, that's when the men would debrief and report. They'd get out of there, they'd get their they'd actually get 4 fingers of whiskey. The Red Cross girls would be standing there by the plane. They had their 4 fingers of whiskey in a tall glass, a water drinking glass. So they'd give them 2, solid couple shots. Calm the nerves, right? Grandpa didn't drink his, but his co-pilot had his mail delivered to the pub anyway. He was a pretty hard drinker. Grandpa said that he could That was Stan. He said he could fly better drunk than I could sober. And Grandpa knew once he got the oxygen mask on him in the morning, he'd be all right, even if he was a little lit from the night before. But he drank Grandpa's whiskey. But all those guys, the Red Cross girls, were standing on the tarmac with their shots of whiskey so that they wouldn't get the shakes, you know, when they put them down. And the men would go straight for debriefing. And they'd say, okay, this ship went down over such and such a place, and I saw it go down, and we saw this many chutes. So they're trying to figure out what happened to those guys. And of course, when Grandpa showed up, when he showed up and landed in England, here he's going to go crawl into one of the bunks that guy either died, parachuted out over occupied territory, got wounded and was in the hospital. Who knows? Who knows? They were replacements and inexperienced, and they did not like it, having to fly with the new guy. They did not like it. New guys are dangerous. And plus, they like the old guy that's now dead. So this is how they lived. And it's how you will have to live in the times that are coming on this world. You'll have to live with an understanding that tragedy is a daily occurrence, and that we have to really be diligent and rise to the occasion, not be the crew that woke up drunk and can't keep formation, because you'll get nailed. You'll get nailed. I watched the videos from this, and to me it looks like there was a major mechanical failure on that P-63 Bell King Cobra, because it looked to me, we'll have to see all the angles, like he was flying straight and level and just immediately nose down. And this happened in seconds, flying less than 100 feet off the ground. And of course it severed the fuselage of Texas Raiders right behind the wing. Came apart, and remember, that thing's full of 100 octane aviation gasoline. I don't think that it was anybody's fault. I think it was a mechanical failure. But these things happen. They happen. And those men lived and died to bring you a message about the heroism of prior generations, and to change this very soft and pacific America into a battle-hardened group that will find some unity, some ability to fight, and some reasons to fight. You know, the Air Force hymn also says, we live in fame or go down in flames. Nothing can stop the Army Air Corps, the U.S. Air Force. And then finally, do you know what an echelon is? It's when one plane's here, one plane's here, and then another one's here, and another one's here. Like geese in a V. One side of a V is an echelon. And yes, the echelon formation is used for a number of things. If you watch flybys, a lot of times they'll fly by in echelon, where the planes are not strictly abreast, but they stagger behind one another. And as the hymn goes on into the second verse, it says, after us there will be more. We defend our nation's borders. After us there will be more. And then it says, in echelon we carry on. Nothing stopped the U.S. Air Force. Which means that there will be others after. These men understand that they will go on to greener pastures, or probably in a battle situation, die. But others will come and carry the torch after them. In echelon, we carry on. Alright, a couple more things. I love one of the opening lines. Atterboys, give her the gun. Atterboys, give her the gun. You know, they just flatly state what has to be done in war and battle. That you get your guns up and go to town. There they are. Here they come. Up they come. Coming to meet our thunder. I don't come to the U.S. anymore, anti-communist. I'm a refugee. Listen, we got an illegitimate, weaponized law enforcement over yonder. This is why I can tell you the truth and teach you. Even though I'm starved out, throttled down, deboosted, I'm censored, I'm limited, I'm shadow banned, I can still bring on to the next generation what must be done. Atom boys, give her the gun. Atom boys, give her the gun. Everybody's waiting for somebody else to do something. Join me on my other platforms. You know, the archive of my radio show is up, and it's a lot faster moving. It's a lot more fun because it's not right there with the camera in my face. I can play little tunes. I can have a lot of fun on there. It's audio only, of course. It's a radio show. But please look for that on gospelgunslingers.com. And please send me $1. We're trying to rebuild conservative journalism from exile in Latin America. Maybe I'll report on the so-called riots in Mexico City. It's not that. This is one of the few nations that's actually moving forward, punishing crime, establishing law and order, self-sufficient in gasoline and diesel. I wish I could say more, guys, but you'll have to come to my other platforms for that. Just understand that war is upon our world. And without at all diminishing the tragedy that happened in Dallas, I want you to understand that those men lived and died to teach you about war and tragedy, and that their predecessors that did not live to be gray-haired wonders were of a different sort, were of a different cloth. They operated and thought and felt differently, and they were ready to bet the farm at every turn, and they had to. They had to. And Grandpa had that boost wheel right there. Right there. He didn't have the gun controls, but he had that boost wheel, and that was his weapon if he had to risk it all to get out of trouble fast, to get out of a bad situation. Crank it up to the maximum. If you don't know, that's what balls to the wall means too. It means those throttles are all the way to the firewall. It means you're running at maximum power, takeoff power. But even beyond that, Grandpa had the boost wheel. He could take the risk to blow the whole thing up if he needed military emergency power. I just need some life support power right now. Come visit me, send me a message. We got a Bible study every day on Telegram where we talk about the Word of God and so forth. And don't make any mistakes. The world is at war. It is at war. It's going to get worse, not better. And this is our opportunity to stand for our lives. Don't be sad about it. But you do have to adapt to daily tragedy. All right. God bless. I'm Pastor Sam, and we're gospelgunslingers.com. Come see us. Bye-bye.